the deer panteth for the water, so my soul longs after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee.
Hello dear friends, welcome back to our Bible sessions. We were reflecting on the effort of David to show Hesed, compassionate love, to Hanun, the new king of Ammonites. But he was misunderstood miserably, and Hanun, the new king, really hurt or behaved in a very hurtful way, and David was really humiliated by that, because his messengers were treated and maltreated and humiliated. And when the news came to David, he sent messengers to the elders who were maltreated by Hanun, and he asked them to stay in Jericho until their beard grows, and that they may not be put to shame before the people. So they stayed there for a long time, and then they came back. And now, as the events turned out to be an open declaration for war, David takes immediate steps. He sent Joab, his military chief, and also the army to attack Ammonites, to settle accounts with them. And when Joab with the army with him were attacking Ammonites, to their shock, they come to realize that the Syrians from the north have made an alliance with Ammonites, and they are coming to attack Israelites. And thus Joab finds the situation totally inimical and destructive. Before them are the Ammonites, and behind them at their rear the Syrians. And Syrians were one of the mighty armies of the time, and hence Joab was really in trouble. And therefore, what did he do? He divided the army with him into two. And one group he handed over to his brother Abishai, and they were fighting with the army of Ammon or the Ammonites. And Joab with his men attacked and fought with the Syrians. And Joab, of course, being a very good warrior, and there would be nobody to defeat him, he was able to make the Syrians flee from before him. And they fled away by him. And when the Syrians fled away, naturally, the Ammonites became afraid. And they fled back into their own city. And taking refuge within the city, they closed the city gate so that the Israelites would not enter the city. And in such cases, what is usually done is the attacking enemy will lay siege to the city and surround the city from a distance. Because if they go close to the city wall, they will be shot at with arrows, and that too with poisoned arrows, and all those who come close to the city wall will be killed in that way. And therefore they kept the city under siege, but from a distance. And that is the situation. And while this war takes place, we can find one or two good features of Joab. And when he saw that the odds are set against him, he expresses his great trust in the Lord. While dividing the army into two and deciding to fight, now he says, "We will try our best for the sake of our God. And now let him do as he likes." And therefore, they are ready to do their part, and God will protect them. Their immense trust in the power of Yahweh and in the ability of Yahweh to conquer the enemies. And according to their belief, it occurred also, we understand. But the good nature and the great faith in God and the capability of God is brought out very well in this passage. And therefore we can see this is the way how David is trying to settle the issues with Ammonites. And while this is going on, we find David is also trying to settle accounts with the Syrians. And a great army was sent against the Syrian army, and they fled before Israel, and many were killed by the Israelites' troops. And thereafter they did not come to attack Israel, or they did not try to help Ammonites further. And thus we see Syrians are defeated in a definitive way by David. And now he can turn his attention fully on the Ammonites, and therefore he sent Joab and all his army to attack the Ammonites. And therefore, thus we see in chapter 10, the story goes forward like this. David wanted to show Hesed to Hanun, the new prince, but he misunderstood and mistreated David and his men. And David sends Joab to fight with the army of Ammonites. But surprisingly, the Syrians came to support them. And thus we find in both sides there were war, but Israelites prevailed over the enemy. And then David definitively broke the power of Syria, and they are subdued. And now only the Ammonites remain. And now David is sending his army to defeat Ammonites. And that's a story we find in the beginning of chapter 11. And chapter 11 is a very important chapter because it conveys many messages for the reader's life. And what all things happen here? First of all, we find David sent the entire army. When the entire army of David is sent, and we find the situation is not so favorable to them fully. But at the same time, it is said David sent the army in the springtime when usually the kings go for to battle. He had already settled accounts with the Syrians, and now David is sending the army to engage against the Ammonites. And they captured the land of the Ammonites, but the capital city remained because it was a walled city. And now what happens? The people, as we mentioned earlier, the army lay a siege around the city wall of Rabbah, the capital of Ammon. And that is the story narrated in 11:1. But there is a clause that is said of King David. When he sent the entire army, Joab and the people, to attack Rabbah, it is said, but David remained in Jerusalem. And this clause is a new beginning with regard to the life of David. When it is said he remained in Jerusalem, what does it really mean? He is failing in the royal duty. Remember what the people clamored for when they demanded for a king. Let the king fight for us, lead us in our battle. And here we find the king sending the people and the army to fight, but the king is taking rest or is not participating in the war. Thus we can see it was the failure in the royal duty of David. Therefore, David's sin starts with this particular event. And then it is said what David did at the time. The army is engaging in the war, but David is in the palace taking rest. And then it is narrated, he slept long until evening. And when it was almost evening, he took up from the nap or siesta, we can say. And then he was just walking to and fro on the terrace of his palace, and he happened to see a woman taking bath in a nearby house, and the woman was taking bath in a bathroom pitch on the roof of the house, because that was the custom of the time. The roof, the sides will be covered, but the roof will be open, or the top will be open. Therefore, one who looks from a higher surface can see the person. And here we find David's sentiments and emotions go to the negative side. Okay, he is led away by certain emotions at that time. And once he looked around, it is a cautious matter, a cautious look. And he should have stopped there. But he doesn't stop. Lustful thoughts come into his mind. And it also shows the lack of control of the eyes. And hence, what does he say? He is looking at the woman, and lustful thoughts come into his mind. And then he is sending messengers to inquire of the woman who this is. And naturally we know the king of Israel, being the king, has the right to marry any woman of the nation, provided she is unmarried. And if somebody is married, that woman belongs to the husband. She is a property of the husband. And nobody else can take claim on the wife of a man or wife of one who is married. And this is what happens here. And there, the situations lead David to a series of sins, we can say. First of all, there is a failure in the royal duty. Then, lack of control of the eyes. And not only that, when he is looking around, the lustful thoughts come and occupy his mind. And normally, the informations received should have restricted him, but he disregarded the informations given. And then what happens? He sends soldiers to get her, and it is equivalent to misuse of royal authority. And the woman, is fetched by the soldiers and brought into the palace of the king, and she and David commits adultery. Whether who is more responsible for the sin is not the question here. David is the one who did all this. And the woman, of course, agreed to it, or she was taken by force. We are not sure. But whatever it be, David is the one who began with everything. And thus we find a series of sins lead to a very important sin or serious sin, the sin of adultery. And what is the lesson of this? The circumstances lead one to sin. And when somebody commits a sin, one goes on committing further sins. And that is what happens. And here we are to reflect a little on the opinions given by the spiritual writers and spiritual fathers. According to them, to commit a sin means to step into the mud. We know if we are going to walk in a marshy place, sometimes it will be very dangerous. The marshy or the muddy area may be sometimes very shallow, or at times it can be very deep. If it is deep, the one who steps into that mud will sink into the mud, and it will be even endangering one's life. And with regard to this particular nature of sin, the spiritual writers say like this: when we commit a sin, we step into the mud. And when we step into the mud of sin, we begin to sink. Sometimes it may not be very deep. It may be deep only up to the level of the ankles. Then we may be able to come out by ourselves. But sometimes it can happen that it is deeper. If our legs go down into the mud until knee or up to the level of the knees, it is dangerous, because one cannot come out of that mud by oneself, because when he tries to take one foot out of mud, the other gets heavily stuck in the mud again. Therefore, somebody is to help one to come out, and that's what we can say. And if it is still deeper, that is, one goes up to what is said, the waist level of the waist. Naturally, it is very, very dangerous. And he cannot come out of that mud unless somebody helps or drags him out of the mud. Therefore, this is what happens. And if it is still deeper, sometimes it can happen, one may be sinking into the mud until ankle, until the waist, and then until the neck, or till the neck is covered by the mud. Then the life is fully in danger, and only few moments remain for him. And if only somebody comes to intervene immediately, he will be able to come out. Otherwise, it will be real difficult. That's what we can say. And therefore, this is the way how the things happen. And this is what the spiritual writers would say, that the committing sin is like stepping into the mud. Unless somebody comes to help one out, he or she will be going into the mud of sin, and that is dangerous for life. Okay, now after the adultery, the woman goes back to the house, her own house, and after a few weeks, she sends a message to King David saying, I am pregnant. And of course, we know David is the responsible one. And she is informing David about all this. Okay, once things are turned badly, we see David wants to keep away from his responsibility in this matter. And what does he do? He wants to cover up his sin. And this is again another danger. When he wanted to cover up his sin, what does he do? He is sending a messenger to Joab in the military field and asked him to send Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba. And the woman, of course, we know, is Bathsheba. And Uriah, the husband, is asked to come to David. And when he came, David asked him, okay, what do you say of the war, about Joab, about the people, and so on? And he said, everything is going well, and the people are fighting hard, and so on. And then David gave him a special permission. You can go home and take rest and have a nice dinner, and so on. When this permission is given, naturally, there's another thing that we should keep in mind. During the time of war, even the soldiers are not allowed to have relations with women, even with one's own wife. That is a holy war stipulation. And now David, being the king, he has the right to give a special privilege to a soldier coming from the field to go home, take rest, and so on, and be with the wife. And of course, David has an ulterior motive. And what is that? David wants to cover up his sin, and he wants to show that it is all from Uriah. And that is why we call this effort to cover up the sin as a clean cover-up. And this effort to cover up the sin, as he said, is a clean cover-up. Nobody will doubt about it. But this doesn't work out. David sleeps in the palace itself, does not go home. Then David takes a second step, and that is a dirty cover-up. Why it is called dirty? The next day, David called him and said, okay, come for the dinner tomorrow. And while dining, David made him drunk. And that should not have happened from the side of a king. And that is why it is called a dirty cover-up, doing something which should not have been done. And still, Uriah did not go home. And when David knew that he did not go home, we find a third effort taken by King David, and that is to write a letter and send it through Joab. And there we find David is practically trying to cover up his sin again. And in the letter, he gives out his decision. Letter is addressed to Joab. And in the letter he said, place Uriah in the hardest, or in the war front where there is hard fighting, and retreat from him, or keep away from him, leaving him alone in the war front, so that Uriah be killed. this is practically a criminal effort to cover up his sin, and therefore this third stage we call a criminal cover-up. And here we find the criminal cover-up taken by David was disastrous, not only for Uriah, but there were others too. Okay, and we will come to that a little later. And there is a fourth effort to cover up his sin by David, and that is called a magnanimous cover-up. And why do we call that? We know when Uriah is dead, Bathsheba laments for him, and after the period of lamentation, David marries the wife of the dead soldier, that is the wife of Uriah. And this marriage with Bathsheba was such a great magnanimous deed before the entire world, because he was willing to marry the widow of a dead soldier. And that is the reason why it is called a magnanimous cover-up. The readers know really the intentions of David, and that is why it is called a magnanimous cover-up. Okay, and when we analyze these efforts to cover up, we have to, the text sheds light on some important points. First of all, a comparison between David and Uriah. David is the lawgiver who asked to violate the law, and Uriah is the subject who reminds David about keeping the law. And that is what happens in the first stage, practically we can say. And then we find Uriah definitely says to the king, as you live, as God lives, I will never do such a thing. And therefore, his greatness, his fidelity to Yahweh, his loyalty to the nation, to the king, everything is brought out. And in a way we can say, if we make a comparison between David and Uriah, Uriah stands very, very taller than David, higher than David, we can say. And again, an ironical situation that happens in the criminal cover-up. Uriah is to carry the death warrant. And why death warrant is issued? Again, it is a very strange thing. He is punished with a capital punishment for the sin of, for his fidelity and loyalty. And it is really an irony. One dies for loyalty, one dies for fidelity. And that's why it is said. And Jobab, he was very careful to keep up his name. And that is why he devised a plan, not according to what David said, but he made his own plan. And he sent Uriah with 50 others. They fought against Ammonites, defeated them, and they chased Ammonites to the city. Practically, Jobab should have blown the trumpet asking them to come by, but he did not. And consequently, Uriah and others approached the city wall, chasing the enemy. And the inevitable occurred. They were shot at with poison, probably with poison arrows, and they died immediately. And now the news is given to David. And here we find something strange still about David. David, who was lamenting at the death of Abner, Amasa, Saul, Jonathan, and so on, has no words of lament or remorse here. Okay, he is so ungrateful, it would seem, or his heart is really hard-hearted. That is what we can think of him now. And the reason is he is going deeper into the mud of sin, and his conscience never troubles him now. And that is why he has gone so deep into the mud of sin. And now we see David achieved whatever he wanted. And here we have to remember what we said earlier. He goes beyond the script written for him by God. He is writing his own script, as if an actor goes beyond the script given by the director. This is what David does here. And now the director of the drama, and here it is Yahweh, he sees all this, and it is time for him to intervene. And that is what we find here. He intervenes into the life of David. And this is clearly mentioned in chapter 11, verse 27, the last part. But the thing that David did was not pleasing to Yahweh. And therefore, he sent prophet Nathan to David. And see, David built up his own world, his own life, forgetting God and forgetting God's plan. But he could not go far. God intervened. And this is what happens in the life of every individual who commits sin. One commits sin and he goes deeper and deeper into the mud of sin when somebody is reluctant to come out of it. And here we will see he is reluctant to come out of that sin. If only one gets the light shown by another or the help from another, he can come out of the mud of sin. And David was not ready to come out of that sin easily because he was really hard-hearted. And here thus we see the immediate serious sins committed by David. First, there is adultery, and second, there will be the murder of Uriah, and thirdly, the appropriation of the wife of Uriah. Thus, three very serious sins are committed by David, and he is going away from the control of Yahweh. He makes himself his own God to such an extent that we can say, and therefore he is asserting himself, and thus we can say he is committing a very serious sin. And this is what we can reflect on chapter 11. And when we come to chapter 12, we will find how the effort taken by God through prophet Nathan helped David to come out of his sin. And that we will do in the next session. Okay, thank you.
Almighty God, we thank you for inspiring us to read your scriptures and to meditate upon them day and night. Relying on all your promises, we humbly implore that the words of scripture may also be not just signs on a page, but channels of grace into our hearts. Amen.